In a glittering restaurant, tech millionaire Leonard King, dining with his new girlfriend, freezes as his pregnant black ex-wife, Amara, steps in, unraveling a past he thought buried. Their collision sparks a journey of redemption, courage, and unexpected hope. Before diving in, share where you're watching from and rate this heartfelt tale from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your voice matters. Enjoy. The restaurant glowed under a constellation of crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing across polished silverware and wine glasses that caught the city's pulse beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Leonard King, tech millionaire, sat at a corner table, his tailored navy suit sharp against the cream linen. Across from him, Sienna, a young lawyer with eyes like polished amber, leaned forward, her laughter soft but calculated, as if testing the waters of their first date. The air smelled of truffle oil and ambition, the low hum of conversation weaving through the clink of glasses and the distant notes of a jazz quartet. Leonard's fingers traced the rim of his bourbon glass, his smile practiced, his mind half on Sienna's story about a courtroom win, half on the deal that could crown his career. A billion-dollar merger hinging on a community arts project he barely understood. The door opened, a subtle shift in the room's gravity, like a tide pulling back before a wave. Leonard didn't notice at first, his focus on Sienna's poised gesture as she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. But then the air tightened, the way it does when someone enters who doesn't belong to the moment, but reshapes it. He glanced toward the entrance, a reflex, expecting nothing more than another suit or socialite. Instead, his breath caught, his hand freezing mid-gesture, the bourbon glass tilting slightly in his grip. There she was, Amara, his ex-wife, framed by the golden arch of the doorway. Her presence hit like a stone through glass, splintering the evening's careful orchestration. Amara stood tall, her dark skin luminous under the warm lights, her hand resting lightly on the curve of her pregnant belly. Her black dress hugged her frame with quiet elegance, her braided hair catching glints of gold from the chandelier above. She moved with a grace that didn't beg for attention but commanded it, her eyes scanning the room with a calm that Leonard remembered too well. 5 years had passed since he'd last seen her, since he'd walked out of their cramped apartment with a suitcase and a muttered apology, leaving her with nothing but unpaid bills and his fractured pride. He'd told himself it was for her sake, that she deserved better than a man drowning in startup debt. Now, seeing her radiant and unbroken, that lie crumbled like ash. Sienna's voice cut through the haze. "Leonard." Her tone was light but edged, her gaze following his, to the woman now being seated across the room. "Who is she?" The question hung like a blade, polite but razor-sharp. Leonard's throat tightened, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears. He wanted to look away, to dismiss the moment, but Amara's presence pinned him to the spot. The restaurant's murmur faded, the jazz notes dissolving into a distant hum. He set the glass down, the clinking against the table too loud in his ears. "She's my ex-wife," he said, the words heavy, like stones dropped into still water. Sienna's wineglass paused halfway to her lips, her eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with the sharp curiosity of a lawyer scenting a hidden truth. "Your ex-wife?" Her voice stayed even, but the subtext was clear. "You never mentioned being married." Leonard stared at his plate, the seared scallops untouched, their delicate arrangement now absurd against the chaos in his chest. "It was a long time ago," he managed, the excuse thin, brittle. "Before the company, before all this." Sienna tilted her head, studying him like a case file. "You don't look like it was that long ago." Her words weren't cruel, just precise, cutting through his composure. Across the room, Amara settled into her chair, her movements deliberate, her pregnancy evident, but her poise unshaken. She hadn't noticed him, or if she had, she gave no sign. That indifference stung more than any confrontation could. Leonard's mind churned, replaying the nights he'd spent convincing himself that leaving her was noble, that his ambition was a gift to her freedom. Now, watching her glow with a life he didn't know, he felt the weight of every choice he'd buried. "Is the child yours?" Sienna's question was soft, almost clinical, but it landed like a punch. Leonard exhaled, his fingers gripping the table's edge. "No," he said, too quickly. "We haven't spoken in years." But doubt crept in, a shadow he couldn't shake. He didn't know who the father was, didn't know the shape of Amara's life now, where she lived, what art she loved, what dreams she carried. All he knew was that seeing her had cracked something inside him, something he'd spent years building walls around. Sienna leaned back, her expression unreadable, her fingers tracing the stem of her glass. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Her voice was quiet, but her eyes were sharp, dissecting him. "I've never seen you like this." Leonard forced a smile, but it felt like a grimace. He wanted to explain, to say that Amara wasn't just a ghost, but a mirror, reflecting the man he'd been before the boardrooms and the wealth. Instead, he said nothing, his gaze drifting back to Amara. She laughed softly with her companion, a woman in a tailored blazer, her hand gesturing with the same fire he'd once known. The sight was a blade, twisting deeper, because she didn't need him. Not his apologies, not his presence. The waiter approached, offering dessert menus, but Leonard waved him off. The city lights shimmered outside, indifferent to the storm brewing at their table. Sienna set her glass down, her posture shifting, as if she were already stepping back from the evening. "What now, Leonard?" she asked, her tone light, but laced with expectation. He had no answer. The weight of Amara's presence, the unspoken questions in Sienna's gaze, and the echo of his own regrets pressed against him, dense and unyielding. He looked at Amara again, across a sea of candlelit tables, and realized that the night wasn't just a dinner interrupted. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The night wasn't just a dinner interrupted. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Leonard King left the restaurant with Sienna's parting glance burning in his mind, her silhouette fading into the city's neon blur. He drove through streets that felt too narrow, the weight of Amara's presence clinging to him like dust on a desert road. By morning, the shock of seeing her had hardened into a single, unyielding truth. Amara held the key to his billion-dollar deal, and their paths were about to collide again, whether he was ready or not. The boardroom smelled of polished oak and coffee, its long table reflecting the skyline through tinted windows. Leonard sat at the head, his tie loosened, his eyes scanning reports that detailed the community arts fund Amara now directed. The fund was no charity case. It was a powerhouse, courted by corporations for its cultural clout and grassroots reach. His merger hinged on its partnership, a linchpin for investor confidence. But Amara, with her quiet fire and unyielding principles, wasn't the kind of woman to bend for a checkbook. Leonard knew this, and it made his jaw tighten as he prepared for their first meeting since that night. The Arts Fund's office was a stark contrast to his glass and steel empire, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and mismatched chairs, humming with the energy of artists and volunteers. Amara stood at the front of the meeting room, her presence commanding despite the loose sweater that softened the curve of her belly. Her braids were pulled back, her eyes sharp as she outlined the fund's vision to a dozen suits, including Leonard's team. He sat near the back, his fingers drumming silently on his knee, watching her wield authority like a rancher taming a storm. She spoke of community, legacy, and art as resistance, her words carrying a weight that made the room lean in. Leonard felt a pang, not just of guilt, but of awe. This wasn't the Amara he'd left behind. This was a woman who'd carved her trail. When the floor opened for questions, Leonard's CFO, A man with a drawl as slick as oil pressed her on timelines and budgets. Amara's response was measured but cutting, her voice steady as she countered with data and a pointed reminder that the fund's mission wasn't a line item to be squeezed. Leonard felt the room shift, his team exchanging glances, sensing the steel in her. He raised his hand, his voice low but clear. "Ms. Johnson, how do you balance artistic integrity with corporate demands?" The question was neutral, but his use of her maiden name felt like a misstep, a ghost of their past slipping through. Her eyes met his, unflinching, and for a moment, the room dissolved. "Integrity isn't balanced, it's non-negotiable," she said, her tone like a whip cracking clean. "We partner with those who see our communities as more than a PR stunt." The jab landed, and Leonard's lips twitched, not in amusement, but in recognition. She was calling his bluff, forcing him to play on her terms. The meeting spiraled from there, a verbal duel cloaked in civility. His team pushed for branding rights. She countered with demands for local artist control. He suggested streamlined approvals. She insisted on community input. Each exchange was a spark, threatening to ignite the dry tinder of their shared history. After the meeting, Leonard lingered as the room emptied, his boots scuffing the concrete floor. Amara was gathering papers, her movements deliberate, her back to him. "You've built something real here," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She turned, her eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with the wariness of someone who'd been burned before. "It's not about me, Leonard. It's about them." She nodded toward the hallway, where volunteers laughed over coffee, their voices carrying the warmth of a shared purpose. He nodded, but the words he wanted to say, about her strength, about his regrets, stuck in his throat like burrs. Their next encounter was at a stakeholder dinner, a high-stakes affair in a penthouse overlooking the city's jagged horizon. Amara arrived late, her black blazer sharp against her white blouse, her pregnancy a quiet defiance amid the suits and champagne flutes. Leonard watched her work the room, charming investors with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When they were paired for a discussion on project scope, the air crackled. He proposed a scaled-down timeline to secure funds. She shot it down, her voice low but fierce, insisting on long-term community impact. The table watched, sensing the undercurrent as if they were witnessing a duel in a dust-choked corral. By the night's end, Leonard's frustration boiled over. In a quiet corner, he cornered her, his voice tight. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Amara. This deal could change everything." She didn't flinch, her gaze steady as a horizon line. "For who, Leonard? Your boardroom or my people?" Her words cut deeper than he expected, exposing the chasm between his pragmatism and her conviction. He stepped back, the city lights blurring behind her, and realized this wasn't just about the deal. It was about proving he could face the woman he'd left without running again. This wasn't just about the deal. It was about proving he could face the woman he'd left without running again. Leonard King stood alone in the penthouse's dim corner, the city's skyline a jagged scar against the night. Amara's words still echoed, sharp as a spur's bite, challenging not just his strategy, but the man he'd become. By morning, their battle lines were drawn, and Leonard knew the next meeting would be a reckoning, one where secrets would rise like dust on a wind-swept plain. The Arts Fund's warehouse buzzed with a different energy now, the air thick with paint fumes, and the low hum of a dozen conversations. Leonard arrived early, his boots scuffing the concrete as he navigated stacks of canvases and half-finished sculptures. The meeting was set to finalize the project's scope, a make-or-break moment for his merger. Amara stood near a whiteboard, marker in hand, sketching a timeline with the precision of a rancher mapping a cattle drive. Her pregnancy was more pronounced now, her blouse stretched taut, yet she moved with a quiet strength that made the room orbit around her. Leonard took a seat, his jaw tight, knowing this wasn't just about budgets. It was about the chasm between them, wide as a canyon and just as treacherous. The discussion kicked off like a storm, rolling in slowly. Amara laid out the fund's priorities: local artists, youth programs, and cultural preservation. Leonard's team countered with corporate branding and accelerated timelines, their voices smooth but relentless, like a river carving stone. He stayed quiet at first, watching Amara deflect each push with facts and a fire that didn't flicker. Then, during a lull, one of his VPs, a wiry man with a salesman's grin, leaned forward. "Ms. Johnson, with respect, your focus on community is noble, but this project needs scale. Who's funding your vision? And who's the father footing the bill for your personal choices?" The room froze. The question a low blow, crude as a rattlesnake strike. Amara's eyes narrowed, but her voice stayed steady as a horizon line. "My personal choices are irrelevant to this table," she said. Her words clipped, deliberate. "But since you've asked, I'll clarify. There's no father in the picture. I chose to become a mother through a donor, on my terms, because I don't wait for permission to build the life I want." The admission landed like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Leonard's breath caught, not just from the revelation but from the weight of her conviction. She'd done what he never could, faced her fears head-on, without a safety net. The VP stammered, but Amara didn't let him recover. She pivoted, redirecting to the project's community impact, her voice rising like a preacher's call, pulling the room back to her. Leonard watched, his mind churning. He'd left her because he feared dragging her down with his failures, but here she was, building a life without needing anyone's approval. The truth of her choice, artificial insemination, single motherhood, cut deeper than he expected. It wasn't just courage. It was a defiance of the world that had broken her trust, a world he'd helped shatter. As the meeting broke, Leonard lingered, his fingers tracing the edge of a table cluttered with art supplies. Amara was across the room, speaking with a young artist, her laughter soft but genuine, like a breeze through sagebrush. He approached, his steps heavy, the weight of her revelation pressing against his ribs. "Amara," he started, his voice low, rough as gravel. "What you said back there, that took guts." She turned, her gaze wary but not cold, like a Mustang sizing up a stranger. "It wasn't for you to hear, Leonard. It was for me to say." He nodded, swallowing the urge to apologize again. "I didn't know," he said instead, "how much you'd changed. Not just the fund, but you. Choosing this," he gestured vaguely toward her belly, "alone. That's a strength I never had." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement. "I stopped waiting for someone to make my choices right," she said. "After you left, I learned I didn't need anyone to validate me. Not then. Not now." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true, sharp as a spur digging into his pride. He wanted to ask more. Why she'd chosen this path, what had driven her to rebuild without him. But the space between them felt fragile, like a rope bridge swaying over a gorge. Instead, he shifted gears. "The project," he said. "I want to make it work. Not just for the deal, but for what you're building here." Her eyes searched his, looking for the catch. "Then prove it," she said, turning back to her work. "Show me you're not just chasing a win." As Leonard left the warehouse, the late afternoon sun burned low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Amara's words clung to him, not just her defiance, but the quiet power of her independence. He'd spent years running from failure, building an empire to bury his shame. But Amara had faced hers, carved a path through it, and emerged whole. The realization didn't just challenge him, it demanded he step up or step aside, and for the first time he wasn't sure which he'd choose. For the first time, Leonard wasn't sure which he'd choose, step up or step aside. But the weight of Amara's challenge clung to him like dust on a long trail. The city's pulse faded as he drove, the horizon swallowing the sun, leaving only the question of what it meant to prove himself to a woman who no longer needed his proof. Days later, a different kind of storm would force his hand, one that no boardroom could prepare him for. The Arts Fund's warehouse was a hive of activity under the late afternoon sky, its windows catching the last glints of light like a prairie fire. Leonard had started showing up more, not as a suit pushing an agenda, but as a man carrying paint cans, stacking chairs, listening to the artist's plans. Amara noticed but said nothing, her silence neither warm nor cold, just watchful, like a hawk circling a canyon. Tonight, they were finalizing a community mural project, a cornerstone of the fund's outreach and a critical piece of Leonard's merger puzzle. The room buzzed with volunteers, their voices sharp with purpose, but Amara stood at the center, her presence steady despite the faint lines of fatigue creasing her brow. Her pregnancy was heavier now, her movement slower, yet she directed the chaos with a rancher's calm, every gesture precise as a lasso's throw. Leonard lingered near a table strewn with blueprints, his sleeves rolled up, his tie long discarded. He'd taken to these meetings like a man finding his footing on uneven ground, offering ideas without dominating, listening more than he spoke. But as Amara outlined the mural's timeline, her voice faltered mid-sentence. A shadow crossed her face, her hand pressing low on her belly, her breath hitching like a horse spooked by a snake. The room didn't notice at first, but Leonard's eyes were on her, sharp as a coyote's. She steadied herself against the table, her knuckles whitening, and murmured something to a volunteer before stepping toward the back office. Leonard followed, his boots heavy on the concrete, his pulse kicking like a stampede. "Amara," he said, catching her just inside the cluttered office, where paint cans and papers spilled across a desk. She leaned against the wall, her face pale, her breathing shallow, but controlled. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was thin, like a rope fraying under strain. "Just a cramp. It'll pass." Leonard's gut twisted. He'd seen her strong, unyielding, but this was different. Vulnerability raw as a desert wind. "You're not fine," he said, stepping closer, his hand hovering but not touching. "You need a doctor, now." Her eyes met his, a flicker of resistance giving way to something softer, something scared. She nodded, barely, and that was enough. The drive to the hospital cut through the city, like a blade through sagebrush. Rain had started, sudden and sharp, drumming the windshield as Leonard gripped the wheel, his jaw tight. Amara sat beside him, one hand braced against the dashboard, the other clutching her belly. She didn't speak, her breaths measured but strained, each one a reminder of the stakes. Leonard stole glances, her silhouette stark against the wet glass, and felt a fear he hadn't known since the nights he'd walked away from her years ago. The hospital loomed ahead, its lights cutting through the storm like a beacon on a dark plain. Inside, the maternity ward was a blur of white coats and beeping monitors. Amara was whisked to a room, her hospital gown swallowing her frame, as nurses hooked up IVs and murmured about preterm labor. Leonard stayed close, his presence steady but unintrusive, like a shadow that didn't crowd. She lay back, her face tight with pain, but her eyes found his, holding them like an anchor. "You didn't have to come," she whispered between contractions, her voice rough but not accusing. He pulled a chair close, his hand finding hers, warm and trembling. "I did," he said, simple as truth. "I'm here." The hours stretched, taut as a barbed wire fence. Leonard didn't move, fetching water when her lips cracked, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead when sweat beaded her skin. The doctors spoke of stopping the labor, of medications and monitoring, But to Leonard, it was just noise. All that mattered was Amara, her strength a quiet fire even now, and the unspoken fear that hung between them. In a moment of stillness, as a nurse adjusted a monitor, he leaned close. "I left you once because I was scared," he said, his voice low, raw as a wind-scoured rock. "Scared I'd fail you, drag you down. I told myself it was for you, but it was cowardice. I'm not running now." Her eyes searched his, not forgiving, not yet, but listening. A contraction hit and she gripped his hand, her strength fierce, pulling him through the pain with her. As dawn broke, the storm outside eased, and so did the crisis. The contraction slowed, the baby safe for now, still nestled in Amara's womb. She exhaled, exhausted but whole, her hand still in his. "You stayed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, not a question, but a fact, heavy as a stone dropped in still water. Leonard nodded, his throat tight. "I'm not going anywhere." The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the monitor's beeps a steady pulse, and for the first time, Leonard felt the weight of his past shift. Not gone, but lighter, like a saddle lifted after a long ride. The hospital room held a fragile quiet, the monitor's steady pulse weaving through the dawn's first light, and Leonard's promise, "I'm not going anywhere," hung like a vow etched in stone. Amara's hand rested in his, her grip softening as the crisis faded, leaving them both raw but tethered. Weeks later, under a sky bruised with the promise of new beginnings, the real test of that vow would arrive, not in chaos, but in the sacred stillness of a birth. The city slept as Leonard drove Amara back to the hospital, the streets empty, save for the occasional flicker of a street lamp. Her contractions had started again, steady this time, not a false alarm, but a call to action, like the low rumble of a herd moving across the plains. Amara sat beside him, her breathing deliberate, her hands folded over her belly, now heavy with the life she'd chosen. Leonard's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, his focus sharp, but his mind drifted to the weight of her trust. The way she'd let him stay, let him drive, let him be part of this moment. The hospital loomed ahead, its white walls stark against the pre-dawn gray, a beacon in a world still cloaked in shadow. Inside, the maternity ward was a hive of quiet efficiency. Nurses moved like wranglers, their hands steady as they guided Amara to a room bathed in soft light. She settled into the bed, her face taut but resolute, her braids spilling across the pillow like dark rivers. Leonard stood close, his boots scuffing the linoleum, his presence a silent anchor. The hours unfolded slowly, each contraction a wave rolling through her, her breath measured but fierce, like a wind carving through a canyon. He didn't speak, didn't need to, his hand in hers, his eyes meeting hers in the spaces between pain, said enough. The nurses' voices were a low hum, their instructions calm but urgent, and Amara followed them with a strength that made Leonard's chest ache with admiration. As the sky outside softened to a pale gold, the moment arrived. No drama, no storm, just a final push and a cry. Sharp, clear, cutting through the room like a hawk's call over open land. The nurse lifted the baby, tiny and flushed, her fists curled tight, her dark curls a soft halo against her skin. Amara reached out, her arms trembling but sure, and the child was placed on her chest. A perfect weight, a living promise. Leonard stood frozen, his breath shallow, watching as Amara's face softened, her eyes tracing every detail of her daughter. "Aurora," she whispered, the name a quiet hymn, a nod to the dawn breaking beyond the window. Leonard felt the words settle into him, heavy as a river stone, carrying the weight of hope reborn. He moved closer, his hand hovering near Amara's shoulder, not daring to intrude but unable to stay back. She looked up, her eyes tired but bright, and nodded slightly, an invitation. He touched Aurora's tiny hand, her fingers curling reflexively around his, and something in him cracked. Not with pain, but with wonder, raw as a sunrise over untouched prairie. The room seemed to shrink, the monitor's beeps fading, the world narrowing to the three of them. Amara's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "You're here," she said. Not a question, but a recognition, like naming a landmark after a long ride. Leonard stayed through the morning, learning the rhythm of the hospital room, the way nurses checked vitals, the way Amara's breathing steadied as she held Aurora, the way the light shifted across the walls. He fetched water, adjusted pillows, and when Amara dozed, he sat by the crib, watching Aurora's tiny chest rise and fall. He whispered to her, not promises but stories, of the city's pulse, of the mother who'd chosen her, of the man still finding his way. His voice was rough, unpracticed, but it felt right, like a cowboy humming to calm a skittish foal. When Amara woke, she watched him, her gaze not soft but searching, like a tracker reading signs in the dust. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice low, testing. "Be here like this." Leonard met her eyes, his own steady for once. "I want to," he said, simple as truth. "Not to fix anything, but because this, you, matters." She didn't reply, but her silence wasn't rejection, just space, like a wide valley letting the wind pass through. The days that followed were a quiet dance. Leonard learned to change diapers, his hands clumsy but earnest, and rocked Aurora when Amara needed rest. He didn't push, didn't ask for more than the moment allowed, but each small act, warming a bottle, folding a blanket, felt like a step towards something solid. Amara watched, her trust growing not in words, but in the way she let him stay, let him hold her daughter, let him share the weight of this new life. As they prepared to leave the hospital, the dawn light spilling gold across the city, Leonard carried Aurora's car seat, his steps careful, his heart full. The road ahead was uncharted, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to ride it. The road ahead was uncharted, but for the first time, Leonard wasn't afraid to ride it. He carried Aurora's car seat out of the hospital, the dawn light painting the city gold, Amara walking beside him, her steps steady but slow, a new mother's caution. Weeks later, that same light would spill across a different threshold, one that promised not just shelter, but a chance to build something enduring, brick by weathered brick. The neighborhood was a quiet stretch of the city's edge, where oak trees cast long shadows and sidewalks cracked under the weight of time. Amara had chosen a single-story brick house, its chipped shutters and sagging porch more honest than polished, like a stallion past its prime but still proud. Leonard pulled up in his truck, the engine's rumble fading as he stepped onto the uneven drive. Amara stood at the gate, her hand resting on her belly, Aurora cradled in a sling against her chest. The "for sale" sign leaned tiredly in the yard, a flag of surrender to their new beginning. "It's not much," Amara said, her voice low, like she was speaking to the house itself. "But it's got room to grow." Leonard saw it too, not the flaws, but the possibility, like a patch of earth waiting for seed. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and dust, its floors creaking under their boots, like a song half forgotten. Sunlight poured through wide windows, catching motes in the air, and the walls bore the faint scars of lives lived before. Amara moved slowly, her fingers trailing along the hallway, imagining Aurora's laughter echoing through the rooms. Leonard followed, his steps careful, as if crossing a riverbed after a flood. He carried a box of her things, books, paints, a small lamp she'd always loved, his hands steady, but his heart unsteady, aware this was her space, not his, unless she chose to let him in. The realtor had been delayed, so they stood in the empty living room, the silence thick, but not heavy, like a sky before rain. Amara pointed to a corner. "The crib could go there," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Near the window, so she sees the morning." Leonard nodded, picturing it, the image sharp as a Polaroid. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence was his offer, his willingness to carry nails or hammerboards, whatever she needed to make this hers. When the realtor finally arrived, a brisk woman with a clipboard, Amara signed the papers with a steady hand. Her signature, a claim staked in ink. Leonard watched, his chest tight, knowing this was her victory, but hoping, quietly, to share its shadow. Days later, he returned with a gift, a rocking chair, its wood worn smooth by years, bought from a vintage shop she'd once mentioned in passing. He left it on the porch with a note, "For Aurora, under the stars." Amara didn't call to thank him, but a photo arrived in his inbox that night, the chair glowing under the porch light, captioned with a single heart. It wasn't gratitude. It was acknowledgement. A crack in the wall between them, small but real. Leonard took it as a sign and kept showing up, not with grand gestures but with workman's hands. He fixed a loose hinge, patched a leak in the roof, and carried boxes until his shoulders ached. Amara unpacked her books herself, arranging them on a shelf by the kitchen, her movements deliberate, claiming the space as her own. One afternoon, they stood in the backyard, a scrappy patch of grass framed by a sagging fence, wild vines curling, like they were holding the place together. Amara held Aurora, now a month old, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. Leonard leaned against a tree, its bark rough under his palm, the air smelling of earth and possibility. "This feels like a home," he said, his voice low, testing the words. Amara glanced at him, her eyes sharp but not unkind, like a hawk sizing up the wind. "It's getting there," she said, her tone neither inviting nor dismissive, just true. He started coming by more, not assuming but offering, groceries when her fridge was bare, a ride when the bus was too slow. They talked over coffee in the kitchen, about paint colors for the nursery, about Aurora's first smile, about the mural project that was gaining traction. The conversations weren't deep, not yet, but they were steady, like a river finding its course. Leonard didn't push, didn't ask for a place in her life, but he showed up, his boots leaving faint tracks on her porch. Amara watched, her trust not given but earned, moment by moment, like a fence mended one post at a time. As moving day neared, the house began to hum with life. Leonard assembled a bookshelf, its joints creaking as he tightened screws, while Amara hung a canvas above the fireplace. A bold piece, all earth tones and defiance, painted by a local artist she'd championed. They worked in tandem, not as partners, but as two souls circling the same fire, wary but warming to its heat. By dusk, the house stood ready, not perfect but theirs. Amara's by choice, Leonard's by hope. As he stepped onto the porch, the rocking chair swaying slightly in the breeze, he felt the weight of the past shift, not gone, but reshaped, like a riverbed after a long rain. The house stood ready, not perfect but theirs, Amara's by choice, Leonard's by hope, as he stepped onto the porch, the rocking chair swaying in the breeze like a promise taking root. The weight of the past had shifted, reshaped like a riverbed after rain, and as weeks turned to months, Leonard and Amara began to walk a new trail together. One, neither had mapped, but both were learning to tread. The community center smelled of crayons and coffee, its walls plastered with children's drawings, bright as wildflowers in a spring canyon. Leonard had carved out mornings here, no longer the suit calling shots, but a man hauling tables, sorting art supplies, and reading to kids with sticky hands and wide eyes. His Italian leather boots were traded for scuffed sneakers, his watch left in a drawer. time now measured by the laughter of a 6-year-old mastering a paintbrush. Amara noticed her visits to the center were more frequent, her gaze lingering not with judgment but curiosity, like a rancher eyeing a horse finding its stride. She'd bring Aurora, tucked in a carrier, her tiny gurgles blending with the center's hum, and Leonard would catch her watching him, her silence a question he was still answering. Their days settled into a rhythm, not planned but natural, like a river finding its banks. Leonard drove Amara to the Arts Fund's new exhibit openings, her vision for community art now drawing crowds and donors. The mural project a beacon that even his investors couldn't ignore. They'd talk on the way back, her voice steady as she spoke of budgets or Aurora's latest milestone, his listening more than he spoke, learning the shape of her world. At the house, he fixed a creaky porch step or hung curtains she'd picked, his hands steady with purpose, each task a stitch in a seam he'd once torn. Amara didn't ask him to stay, but she didn't turn him away. Her door was left open like a gate unlatched. One evening, under a sky streaked with pink and gold, they sat in the backyard, Aurora asleep inside, the baby monitor glowing faintly on the porch. The air smelled of cut grass and earth, the old tree above them casting shadows, like a story half told. Leonard leaned back, his fingers tracing the grain of a wooden chair he'd sanded himself. "I stepped back today," he said, his voice low, rough as gravel. "Told the board I'm not running the show anymore. Hired a new CEO, restructured the whole damn thing." Amara's eyes flicked to him, sharp but not surprised, like she'd seen the dust settling before he spoke. "Why now?" she asked, her tone even, testing the ground. He looked at the horizon, the city's glow faint in the distance. "Because I built it running from something, you, me, the man I was. It's strong enough without me now. I want to be here, not there." Her silence wasn't cold, just heavy, like a sky weighing whether to rain. "Here's not easy, Leonard," she said, her hand resting on the arm of her chair, inches from his. "It's not a place you just show up to. It's work." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, I'm learning." Their work together grew, not as a grand gesture but a steady build, like a fence mended post by post. Leonard joined Amara at community meetings, his voice quieter now, amplifying hers rather than leading. When the Arts Fund faced a funding snag, he didn't throw money at it but spent hours with her, poring over grants, his mind sharp but his ego checked. At home, he'd rock Aurora when Amara painted, her canvases filling the house with bold strokes of color, stories of resilience she'd learned to tell. He'd watch her, paint smudged on her hands, and feel a pride not for himself, but for the woman she'd become, the woman he hadn't broken. One morning, as frost dusted the grass, Amara asked him to stay for breakfast. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toast, Aurora babbling in her high chair. They ate in companionable silence, the clink of forks a soft rhythm. "You're different," Amara said, her eyes on her plate, her voice soft but clear, like a stream cutting through stone. "Not just the work. You're stiller." Leonard set his mug down, his chest tight. "I had to be," he said. "The man who left you couldn't sit here. I'm trying to be the one who can." She looked at him then, not with forgiveness, but with something closer. Trust. Fragile as a new shoot but growing. "I don't need saving, Leonard," she said. "But I don't mind you walking beside me." The words landed like a rope thrown across a gap, not pulling him in but offering a line. He took it, his nod small but sure, and they cleared the table together, their hands brushing once, not accidental, but not forced, like two trails converging in the dust. As winter crept closer, the house felt warmer, not from the heater, but from the life they were building, moment by moment. Leonard didn't ask for a title, father, partner, anything. Knowing names came after deeds. Amara didn't offer one, but her glances softened. Her laughter came easier, and when she handed him Aurora to hold, it felt like a claim staked, not in words, but in time. The path ahead wasn't clear, but they walked it, side by side, the ground beneath them, solid enough for now. The path ahead wasn't clear, but Leonard and Amara walked it, side by side, the ground beneath them solid enough for now. Under a winter sky heavy with the promise of snow, their shared steps had carved a quiet rhythm, one that held not just hope, but the weight of choices made and kept. By spring, that rhythm would face its final test, not in words, but in a moment that demanded they name what they'd built, under the fading light of a day that felt like home. The backyard was a patchwork of new grass and old earth, the oak tree's branches swaying like a preacher's arms over the small gathering. Amara stood beneath it, Aurora in her arms, her dress a simple cream linen that caught the sunset's glow, her braids loose and framing her face like a crown. Leonard stood beside her, his shirt open at the collar. No tie, no pretense, just a man stripped to his truth. A handful of friends from the Arts Fund and Community Center formed a loose circle, their faces soft with smiles, the air humming with birdsong, and the faint clatter of a neighbor's wind chimes. This wasn't a wedding of grandeur, but a binding of lives, raw and real, as a rope knotted tight after a long drive. The ceremony was brief, led by a local artist, with a voice like gravel, smoothed by a river. No vows were read from paper. Instead, Amara spoke first, her words steady as a horizon line. "I choose this," she said, her eyes on Leonard, Aurora's weight warm against her chest. "Not to erase what was, but to build what is." Leonard's throat tightened, his hand brushing hers, his voice rough but clear. "I'm here to stay," he said. "Not to fix the past, but to walk with you, wherever this trail leads." The artist raised her hands, pronouncing them bound, not by law but by choice. And the small crowd clapped, their laughter rising like dust kicked up by hooves. They didn't kiss, not yet. Instead, their hands clasped around Aurora, her tiny fingers curling into theirs, a bridge between their separate paths. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, and the gathering moved to the porch, where tables held plates of cornbread and grilled vegetables, the kind of meal that tasted like memory. Leonard carried Aurora, her weight a quiet anchor, while Amara poured lemonade, her movements easy, her laughter mingling with the evening's hum. The house, once empty, now thrummed with life, its walls holding the echoes of their new beginning. Later, as the guests drifted away, Leonard and Amara sat on the rocking chair he'd gifted, Aurora asleep inside, the monitor glowing softly beside them. The air smelled of honeysuckle and cooling earth, the night settling like a blanket over the plains. Leonard took a small velvet box from his pocket, its edges worn from days of waiting. He opened it, revealing a gold band, simple but heavy with intent. "I'm not asking for forever," he said, his voice low, steady as a campfire's glow. "I'm asking for today, and every today we can share." Amara looked at the ring, then at him, her eyes sharp but warm, like a sky clearing after a storm. "I'm not the woman you left," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "But I'll take today, and we'll see about tomorrow." She slipped the ring on, not as a promise but a marker, a stake in the ground they'd claimed together. They sat in silence, the chair creaking under their weight, the world beyond the porch fading to a murmur. Leonard's hand rested near hers, not touching but close, like two horses grazing side by side, content in their shared space. Amara's gaze drifted to the yard where fireflies began to blink, their light a quiet pulse against the dusk. "This feels right," she said almost to herself, her voice soft as a breeze through sagebrush. Not perfect, but right. The days that followed were a continuation, not a crescendo. Leonard worked part-time at the community center, teaching kids to mix paints, his hands smudged with color, his laughter freer than it had been in years. Amara's art bloomed, her canvases filling galleries with stories of resilience. Her name now a beacon for local artists. They shared dinners, some nights loud with Aurora's giggles, others quiet with unspoken understanding. When ghosts of the past crept in, memories of his leaving, her rebuilding, they faced them, not with apologies, but with honesty, like ranchers mending a fence after a storm. One evening, as the moon rose, pale and sharp against a velvet sky, they stood under the oak tree again, Aurora asleep in her crib. Leonard held a sketchbook, his pencil tracing the lines of the house, the tree, and Amara's silhouette. She watched, her hand resting on his arm, a touch that carried no weight but trust. "We're a family," she said, the words simple but heavy, like a stone smoothed by a river's flow. Leonard nodded, his eyes on the horizon. The city's glow distant, but no longer calling. The trail they'd walked wasn't straight, but it was theirs. And under that tree, in that house, with that child, they'd found something stronger than regret. A home, built not on promises, but on the courage to stay. Thank you for riding this trail with Leonard and Amara, a story of redemption, courage, and the quiet strength of second chances. We'd love to hear what stirred you most. Share your thoughts and rate their journey from 0 to 10 in the comments, along with where you're tuning in from. Until our paths cross again, stay inspired and keep believing in new beginnings.